In a high-powered world of control and precision, David Carter, a successful CEO, is blindsided when his new assistant, Nina Howard, challenges everything he thought he knew about work and relationships. As their professional connection turns personal, both must confront their vulnerabilities, questioning everything they've built. Will they allow themselves to break down the walls they've spent years constructing? Don't miss this captivating story of ambition, trust, and unexpected love. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will keep you hooked. David Carter, the CEO of a fast-growing tech company, paced back and forth in his office, frustration radiating off him in waves. His perfectly structured world had just been thrown off course. His assistant had resigned unexpectedly, effective immediately. David had no time to deal with the disruption, not with his tightly packed schedule and a series of meetings that could make or break the company's future. As the leader of the company, every move he made had to be precise, calculated. The assistant he was about to hire needed to match that same level of efficiency, someone who could anticipate his next command without being told. "Find me a replacement," he ordered, his voice sharp. His HR director, Patricia, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her clipboard gripped tightly in her hands. She had been on edge ever since the resignation came through. "We found someone. She's waiting outside," Patricia said, a hint of hesitation in her voice. David gave a quick nod, signaling that he didn't have time for delays. Before he could respond, the door opened, and in walked someone he hadn't expected. The woman standing before him was younger than he anticipated, mid-20s at most. Her chestnut hair cascaded in soft waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes met his without the slightest hint of hesitation. She carried herself with an air of confidence that immediately caught David off guard. She wasn't dressed in the usual bland office attire. Instead, she wore a sleek black outfit that exuded a quiet professionalism. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, her voice calm yet assertive as she extended her hand. "I'm Nina Howard. I'll be filling in as your assistant." David hesitated, studying her outstretched hand for a brief second before shaking it firmly. His mind raced with questions, most of which were not entirely welcoming. He didn't have time to train someone new, and the last thing he needed was someone who would add to his already heavy workload. "What's your experience?" he asked flatly, trying to gauge if she had what it took to survive in his world. Nina didn't flinch at his directness. "Not as an assistant," she admitted without hesitation, "but I learn quickly, and I don't waste time." David studied her a moment longer. He had a gut feeling that this wasn't going to work. He needed someone experienced, not someone who would need to be taught every step of the way. But her words rang in his ears. "I don't waste time." Something about her confidence left him intrigued, though he would never admit it. "You have one day," he said, his voice flat. "If you can't keep up, you're out." He moved toward his desk, already thinking about the tasks he would throw her way. Nina simply nodded. "Fair enough." By midday, David had already set a series of deliberately difficult tasks for her, expecting her to stumble. He watched from his office as she managed to navigate each task with ease. She restructured his packed schedule in a way he hadn't even thought of, tracked down a contract buried deep in an outdated filing system, and, somehow, she knew exactly how he liked his coffee, delivering it to his desk without a single word exchanged. David was left in disbelief. He had expected to watch her struggle, to show her the ropes in his world of high stakes and pressure. But she didn't struggle. She thrived. "Assuming you have supernatural abilities?" David remarked dryly when she handed him the revised itinerary with a slight smile. Nina leaned casually against the door frame, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Nope, just observant, and maybe a little stubborn." David couldn't help but feel a flicker of something unusual. "Stubborn?" he asked, his eyebrow arched. "You're not the kind of man who tolerates failure," she replied. "I figured if I didn't prove myself today, I wouldn't be here tomorrow." For the first time in longer than he could remember, David felt a flicker of amusement. The woman was smart, and she wasn't afraid to challenge him. "I like you," he said, his voice a touch softer than usual. Nina grinned. "I try," she said simply. The following days flew by in a blur. Nina continued to impress him at every turn. Not only was she quick and efficient, but she also seemed to have a sixth sense about his needs. She didn't just follow orders, she anticipated them. And unlike his previous assistants, who had remained quiet and deferential, Nina wasn't afraid to speak up when she disagreed with his decisions. Her challenges were never out of defiance, but always backed with thoughtful logic and well-reasoned arguments. David, who had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, found himself rethinking decisions he had never questioned before. Nina wasn't just his assistant. She was a partner, an unexpected ally who brought something to the table that no one else had. And for the first time, David found himself wondering how long it would take for her to realize just how much control she had over him. As the days passed, David couldn't shake the impression Nina had left on him. She was different from anyone he'd ever worked with. While he expected her to falter, she exceeded every expectation he had set. She was quick, sharp, and efficient, but it was something more that intrigued him: her ability to anticipate his needs without being told. It was as if she could read the room, understand his unspoken intentions, and act before he even had to ask. She didn't just manage his schedule, she anticipated his next move, often before he did. It was both unnerving and impressive. One afternoon, as David sat in his office, going over a critical merger proposal, he heard Nina's voice through the intercom. "I've rescheduled your meeting with the investors to 2 p.m., she announced. "I've also cleared your calendar for the next 2 hours to give you time to prepare for the board review. The revised presentation deck is on your desk." David glanced at his watch. It was barely 10 a.m. How had she already planned his entire afternoon? His mind briefly wandered to the thought of firing her, just to prove he could stay in control. But the truth was, he didn't want to. Nina's efficiency, her ability to take charge of his world without hesitation, was beginning to win him over. The following days became a blur of meetings, conference calls, and negotiations. Nina didn't just follow orders. She gave him insights, suggestions, and recommendations that made his work easier and, oddly enough, more enjoyable. She didn't just manage the logistics. She was shaping his work environment in a way that David hadn't even known he needed. One evening, as the clock neared 7 p.m., David found himself in the office alone. His mind was worn from the day's demands, and his body was ready to retreat into the quiet solitude of his apartment. But just as he began gathering his things, he noticed Nina still at her desk, her head bent low over a stack of documents. Her determination was clear in the way her fingers flew over the keyboard, in the subtle furrow of her brow as she scrutinized each file. David didn't know why, but for a moment he just watched her. There was something magnetic about her. She wasn't just working late because she had to. She was invested in the work. As much as she was his assistant, she had her own drive, her own ambition. He admired that, though he would never admit it out loud. He couldn't help himself. He leaned against the doorframe and observed her. "Still working, Nina?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet of the room. Nina didn't startle. Instead, she glanced up, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "I could ask the same thing about you, Mr. Carter. Seems like we both have trouble leaving the office when the work is unfinished." David's lips twitched in the slightest smile. She had a point. "I suppose you're right, but I'm not the one who's been pulling 12-hour shifts this week." Nina shrugged, her eyes still focused on the document in front of her. "It's just part of the job, right?" David's gaze softened, and for the first time, he wondered if she viewed this job the same way he did. She wasn't just here to do menial tasks or keep his calendar in check. She had her own aspirations, her own reasons for excelling at her job. This wasn't just a temporary gig for her, and that realization caught him off guard. "I'm assuming you have a way to unwind after all this?" David asked, his tone casual but with a hint of curiosity. He didn't know why it mattered to him, but it did. Nina looked up from her paperwork, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "I don't know. I guess I just keep busy." David chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "You're something else, Nina." She smiled faintly. "You're not so bad yourself." In the days that followed, Nina continued to impress him. She took charge of projects, streamlined processes that had been neglected, and offered ideas that made David rethink the way he had been running things. The more he saw her work, the more respect he had for her, not just as his assistant, but as someone who could hold her own in a world dominated by men. There was something undeniably captivating about her ability to challenge him, not with defiance, but with intelligence. It wasn't long before David found himself seeking her opinion on more than just work matters. During meetings, when he would typically shut down the suggestions of others, he found himself listening more intently when Nina spoke. There was a certain wisdom in her words that David couldn't ignore, a clarity in her thoughts that made him rethink his own approach. She wasn't just good at what she did, she was exceptional. And as much as David hated to admit it, he began to realize that he needed her more than he had initially thought. It wasn't just about getting through his workday anymore. It was about something deeper, something more, something he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But there was no denying it. Nina had managed to worm her way into his life, and with each passing day, she had started to feel less like an assistant and more like a part of his world. As the days passed, the line between professional and personal began to blur, and David couldn't ignore the mounting tension that had settled between him and Nina. What had started as an efficient working relationship, built on sharp wit and mutual respect, was shifting into something more complicated. It wasn't just that Nina was brilliant at her job, she was. But there was something more that stirred in David every time he caught her gaze. Every time their hands brushed as she handed him a report, or when she gave him one of those knowing smiles that hinted at a deeper understanding between them. One night, after an especially long day of back-to-back meetings, David found himself standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, staring out over the city. The office was empty, save for Nina, who was still working diligently at her desk. Her presence was a constant now, like a steady rhythm in the chaos of his life. He glanced over at her, noting the way her brow furrowed slightly in concentration as she sifted through documents, her fingers moving gracefully over the pages. Despite the late hour, there was a sense of calm about her, a quiet determination that David admired. It wasn't the first time he'd stayed late in the office, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that hadn't been there before. "You never stop working, do you?" David asked, breaking the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. Nina looked up, her green eyes meeting his with a steady, almost amused gaze. "I could ask you the same thing. I'm just trying to stay ahead of the game." David smiled faintly, walking over to her desk. "You've already done that. I haven't had to ask you for anything all day. You've anticipated my every move." Nina shrugged, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "It's what I do." David stood there for a moment, watching her. There was something about Nina that unsettled him. Her ability to read him, to understand the unspoken parts of his world, was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. She wasn't just anticipating his next move, she was challenging him in ways he hadn't anticipated. And for the first time in his life, David found himself unsure of his next step. "I'm not sure I like it," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Nina raised an eyebrow. "Not liking something is usually a sign of fear, Mr. Carter. What's scaring you?" David hesitated. He hadn't meant to reveal that much. "I don't fear anything," he replied, his voice firm, but his eyes betrayed him. Nina didn't flinch at his bravado. She simply studied him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe you should," she said quietly. "Fear doesn't always have to be a weakness. Sometimes it's a reminder of what matters." David's heart skipped a beat at her words. He wasn't used to someone challenging him so directly, especially not someone he worked with so closely. His life had always been about control over his business, his emotions, his surroundings. But Nina had a way of dismantling that control, piece by piece, without even trying. As the conversation lingered in the air, David suddenly felt a shift. For the first time in his life, he wasn't entirely in control. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but he was beginning to realize that Nina had become a force in his life, a presence that made him question everything he had believed about power, control, and emotional distance. The tension between them was undeniable, and David knew it was only a matter of time before something would give. But as much as he tried to fight it, he found himself drawn to her in ways that made him uncomfortable. The line between employer and employee had already been crossed, But it wasn't just about work anymore. It was about something deeper, something more intimate. David's thoughts were interrupted as Nina stood up from her desk, stretching slightly. She walked toward him, her movements fluid and graceful, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm heading out," she said, her voice light, but there was a hint of something more in her tone. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As Nina made her way toward the door, she stopped just short of it, turning to face him. For a brief moment their gazes locked, and David felt his heart race in his chest. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something unspoken between them. Then Nina spoke again. "You know, you're not as unapproachable as you think, David." Her words hung in the air, and just like that, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about her. And for the first time in a long while, David realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to fight it. "Good night, Nina," he said quietly, his voice softer than he intended. She smiled, her eyes filled with a knowing warmth. "Good night, Mr. Carter." As she walked out the door, David stood there, staring after her. The room felt emptier without her presence, but something in him stirred. He couldn't deny it any longer. He was already in too deep, and he wasn't sure he wanted to get out. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change for both David and Nina. Their connection, which had started with a professional spark, had ignited into something far more intense, and they both knew it. Every glance, every subtle touch, every casual conversation carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something neither of them was fully prepared to acknowledge. But despite the tension building between them, both tried to maintain their composure, keeping their professional boundaries intact, or so they thought. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back meetings, David found himself in his office, his mind racing with the upcoming merger. But his thoughts kept straying, constantly circling back to Nina. He had promised himself he would stay focused, but every time she crossed his path, a spark of something he couldn't name, pulled at him. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was unavoidable. Nina was starting to have an effect on him that no one ever had. His thoughts were interrupted when Nina knocked lightly on the doorframe. He looked up to find her standing there, holding a stack of papers. She had a calm, almost serene expression on her face, but there was a hint of something more in her eyes. A quiet challenge, a knowing glance that only seemed to deepen the tension between them. "You asked for these," she said, stepping into the room, her voice steady but warm. She set the papers down on his desk and lingered there for a moment, her gaze meeting his. "I can stay and go over them with you, or I can leave you to your thoughts." David cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the proximity between them. He hadn't realized how much her presence affected him until she was right in front of him, her scent, her warmth, all too close. He stood up abruptly, needing the space, needing to regain control. "Let's go over them," he said, his voice quieter than usual. It wasn't like him to feel so thrown off, but Nina had a way of making him forget himself. As they reviewed the documents together, the conversation veered into more personal territory. Their talks, once strictly professional, began to reveal glimpses of who they really were behind the polished surfaces. Nina shared a bit more about herself, her aspirations, her desire for independence, the way she had always been the one to pick herself up after any failure. David, in turn, found himself speaking more openly than he had in years. He wasn't used to sharing personal thoughts, especially with someone who worked for him, but Nina had a way of making him feel like he wasn't in charge. He could just be himself, for once, without the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Later that evening, after a productive yet emotionally charged discussion, Nina stood up to leave. But as she turned toward the door, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I'm not the kind of person who lets work define me. I'll always give my best, but I don't think I can keep pretending that this," she gestured between them, "is just another job." David's heart skipped a beat at her words. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, what he could say. They both knew what she meant. The line between professional and personal had been crossed a long time ago, and now they had to face it. "I didn't expect this," David finally said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. I didn't expect you. Nina met his gaze, her green eyes unwavering. Neither did I, she replied softly. There was a long, heavy silence between them, as if both were waiting for the other to make the next move. David felt a sudden impulse, an urge to close the distance between them, to make a decision. His usual control, the walls he had built around himself, seemed to crumble in the face of the vulnerability Nina had brought into his life. Before he could second-guess himself, David crossed the room, his hand gently brushing against Nina's as he stood beside her. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only that he didn't want this moment to slip away. Nina looked up at him, her breath catching slightly, and for the first time in weeks, David felt something break inside him. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just about work. It never was." Nina's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him, her hand reaching for his. She didn't need to say anything. The connection between them was clear, undeniable. In that moment, all the tension, all the unspoken words seemed to melt away. The walls David had carefully constructed around his life no longer felt necessary. Nina had managed to slip past them effortlessly, and for the first time, David didn't want her to leave. Before he knew it, they were standing there, inches apart, the air between them charged with something neither of them had anticipated, but both felt deeply. Without a word, Nina leaned in, and David met her halfway. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, both of them surrendering to the emotions they had fought for so long. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise, an acknowledgement that their lives were no longer separate. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. As the kiss ended, they stood in the quiet of the office, their hearts beating in unison. The weight of everything that had brought them to this point was still there. But somehow, it didn't feel so heavy anymore. David pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against Nina's. "What now?" he whispered. Nina smiled, her breath still a little shaky. "Now? Now we figure it out." For the first time in his life, David didn't feel the need to control everything. He didn't have all the answers. And for once, that was okay. With Nina by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The weeks following their quiet acknowledgement of their feelings were a blur of stolen moments, shared glances, and careful navigation of the new dynamic between David and Nina. They were no longer just employer and assistant. They had become something more, something undeniable. But even as their relationship grew more personal, the challenges of their professional lives remained ever present. And the line they had crossed was never as simple as it seemed. David had always believed that business was business. His reputation, his company, everything he had worked for rested on his ability to remain detached, to make decisions based solely on logic and efficiency. But Nina had changed that. She had made him question everything, especially the walls he had spent years building around himself. And now, more than ever, he realized that his world, the one he had fought so hard to control, was no longer the same. It had shifted irrevocably with Nina at its center. The first real test came when one of David's senior executives, a longtime confidant, made a passing remark that struck a chord with him. They were in the midst of a tense meeting discussing the next quarter's projections when Thomas, the executive, mentioned Nina's growing presence in the company. "David, you've been relying a lot on her lately," Thomas said, his voice casual but his tone betraying something more. "Is she becoming more than just your assistant?" David's blood ran cold. He had known this moment would come. The whispers in the office, the glances exchanged in the break room. But hearing it out loud, especially in front of the team, was a different matter entirely. He could feel Nina's eyes on him, but he refused to acknowledge the discomfort that had suddenly taken over the room. "She's exceptional at her job," David replied smoothly, his voice steady but with an edge that couldn't be ignored. "And that's all that matters." Thomas seemed to sense that the topic was closed for discussion, and the meeting continued. But as David looked across the table at Nina, he could see the subtle tension in her posture. She was composed as always, but there was something else in her eyes, something that told him she was still processing the unspoken dynamics between them. Later that evening, as the office began to empty out, Nina stayed behind to finish up some last-minute reports. David found himself standing in the doorway of her office, watching her work. He could hear the soft tapping of her keyboard, the rustling of papers, the quiet hum of the city outside. "Nina," he said softly, stepping inside. She looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and something else, a touch of vulnerability that she rarely showed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. There was an underlying concern in his tone, something that caught Nina off guard. She had always prided herself on keeping her emotions in check, but the events of the day had clearly affected her more than she'd let on. "I'm fine," she replied, offering him a tight smile. "It's just, sometimes it feels like I'm being watched, like everyone is waiting for me to slip up." David's heart sank. He had always known that their relationship would draw attention, but he had underestimated the weight it would place on Nina. She wasn't just the assistant anymore. She was a woman in a world that demanded perfection, especially when it came to power dynamics. "I didn't mean for this to happen," David said, his voice low, filled with a sincerity that surprised them both. He hadn't meant for their feelings to complicate things, especially not in such a public way. But now that they were here, he wasn't sure how to undo what had been done. "I know it's not easy. I don't want to make you feel like you have to hide or prove yourself." Nina leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening. "You didn't make me feel that way, David. I'm not worried about us," she paused, taking a breath, "but I'm worried about what this will mean for my place here. I've worked so hard to get where I am. I don't want anyone thinking I'm here because of you." David stepped closer, kneeling down to her level. He reached out, placing a hand on her desk, his fingers just a few inches from hers. "Nina, anyone who doubts your ability is blind. You've earned every bit of respect you've gotten here. No one can take that away from you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft rustling of paper and the distant hum of the city. Finally, Nina looked up at him, a sense of clarity in her expression. "Then I guess it's time I prove them wrong." David's lips curved into a small smile. "You've already done that." The next few days were a turning point for both of them. Nina threw herself into her work with renewed focus, determined to show everyone, not just the office, but herself, that she belonged in this world, regardless of her personal relationship with David. She handled meetings with grace, corrected errors that even the most seasoned executives had missed, and streamlined processes that had been neglected for too long. David, too, found himself changing. He stood by her more openly, proud of the work she was doing and more determined than ever to protect her from the gossip that had begun to swirl around them. They both knew they couldn't keep their relationship a secret forever, but for now, they were focused on proving that their partnership, both personal and professional, was more than just a passing thing. And as the whispers in the office shifted from doubt to grudging respect, David realized that there was only one person who could truly understand the magnitude of what he had built: Nina. They weren't just a team, they were equals in every sense of the word. And that, David knew, was something worth fighting for. The story of David and Nina teaches us a powerful lesson about vulnerability, trust, and the importance of breaking down barriers. In a world where power and control often dictate success, both David and Nina were forced to confront the idea that true strength lies not in maintaining strict control, but in allowing oneself to be vulnerable. David, a man who had built his empire on precision and control, learned that emotional connections and trusting others were just as essential to his success as his business acumen. Nina, on the other hand, proved that hard work, dedication, and authenticity could overcome even the most difficult challenges, earning respect not just for her skills, but for her unwavering integrity. This story reminds us that the most rewarding relationships, whether personal or professional, are those built on mutual respect, trust, and the willingness to grow together. Sometimes we must let go of our rigid expectations and open ourselves to new possibilities, allowing ourselves to be human, flaws and all. Only then can we truly unlock the potential within ourselves and others. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated with more engaging content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.